I would like to first of all welcome you to this session, and I would also like to thank you, Prof, for making time to grace this day. Where I come from, I would call you Prof, and I would never say your name. Where I stand, I could call you Richard, and that is the strength we have at SPIDA, that we are very multicultural and multidimensional, so we know what to say when. I would also like to thank you for sparing your time to come and attend this session. I personally like the topic of today because we do a lot of work, but we struggle to communicate what we do. And I think, I hope that this presentation will touch on some of the ways that we can make people get to know what we do, and most importantly, disseminate that work for the good use of the last mile, as I call them, the people who are least served by ICT solutions. Those of you who may not be familiar with SPIDA, we work across different developing countries, and IPID is part of our way of working. SPIDA does work in different ways. We work through networks, so IPID becomes a core part of our working through networks. We also do capacity building through different programs. We do research in every project that we fund, and we manage programs. So that's a brief about how SPIDA works. And what we work with involves working in health and well-being. So we look at how ICT can improve health and well-being of those who are least served. We also work in education, where IPID also fits in because it's mainly postgraduate researchers. And we work with what we now call open data and accountability or transparency. We've evolved a lot in that area. Those who are affiliated with SPIDA a long time ago, it used to be called democracy and accountability at some point. So that's just a brief of what SPIDA does, and we would have some leaflets at the end when you leave. But what SPIDA has done in the last 4 or 3 years is that we've realized that research is very important, because a lot of ICT4D initiatives are normally implemented based on goodwill. But what SPIDA has done now is that we have included research in our work, so that before we implement any project, or before, I'll rephrase that, we don't implement, we implement through partners. But before we fund any project, we make sure that there's needs assessment done, so that the project is relevant to the potential beneficiaries. And then during the implementation, we work with researchers in those local contexts to follow up the implementation and inform the partners. So all our projects at the moment have researchers working alongside the implementers. And at the end of it, we also try to evaluate whether we had an impact on what was done for the people, by the people. So without wasting so much time, it's not my day, it's Richard's day. I will once again welcome you, and feel free and enjoy the session. And I hope that by the end of this session, you will also manage to get what SPIDA actually wants you to get today is, apart from the information that Richard will share, you network, and you share contacts, and probably form some collaborations, because that is also very important to us. Thank you very much. It's your turn.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks to Edgar. Thanks to IPID, also to SPIDA for inviting me over here. The session's going to have sort of 2 parts to it. One is more of a workshop-y type approach, talking particularly around writing and disseminating ICT4D research, and we'll see how the time goes. If we've got time at the end, there's a bit more of a presentation oriented component where I could talk a little bit about critical realism and ICT4D research. So I'm going to start off, as I said, by talking largely about the process of writing up our ICT4D research, reflecting to some extent on some of the lessons that I perceive from that. In terms of the kind of speaky content from me, there's probably only about 20-25 minutes of me talking. The rest of the time I hope you'll be talking to each other. So I'll be asking you to pair up or get together in small groups and have a chat about various aspects of what I'm going to cover. What I'm going to cover overall is summarized by this, the CROS acronym, which is a kind of set of steps or a set of issues for us to consider when we are writing up our research. So intention, audience, message, channel, rigor, and originality and significance. Those last three, rigor, originality and significance, are kind of very much burnt onto the minds of UK academics. I don't know if you're aware, but every 6 or so years we have what's called now the Research Excellence Framework, by which every academic in the UK has to submit up to 4 pieces of work. They're then read and rated according to a 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star rating scale. It's anonymized. We never find out what individually our scores are, but our departments get scores, and then if you get 4 stars, you get lots of money. If you get 2 and 1 star, you get no money whatsoever for future research. And the criteria by which the articles that we write are rated is rigor, originality, and significance. Now, one might critique these bureaucratic top-down exercises in rating, but actually we can borrow those criteria because they're very useful in themselves for understanding how to create better quality research. So I'll come to those later on, but first of all, thinking about a couple of questions that we know we ought to ask ourselves when we're doing our research and when we're coming to write up our research or to present our research, but quite often perhaps we don't. First of all, intention. What is your purpose in writing the particular paper? Is it because truly you want to get a particular message out to a particular audience, or is it because it's part of your PhD program and you have to get published, or is it you're looking for a particular promotional opportunities? So first of all, thinking about why am I doing this? Why am I writing this? Of course, it's obvious when you say it that if you don't understand that, how can you understand what you're writing or how to write it well? So stepping back and asking ourselves, what is the purpose? What is the objective we have in writing this particular item? And then, who are we writing for? Again, a question very obvious, but often we don't sit back and ask ourselves about that. I'm reviewing a set of papers at the moment for the IFIP 9.4 conference, hopefully not reviewing anybody's in this room. And you can see for a couple of them, they're really not clear on who their audience is. They're not clear, am I writing for an information systems audience, or am I writing for an ICT4D audience? And you can see in the text that they're havering between the two, few bones thrown to an IS audience, a few bones thrown to an ICT4D audience, and it ends up with a confused piece of work. So, thinking clearly about your audience, and of course about the appropriateness of a particular method of publication for your audience. Surely it's true that if you're looking for a policy or a practitioner audience, an academic journal is not going to be the right way to go. How often do policy and practitioner audiences read those? There are other methods, strategy briefs, reports, and so on, that are good for addressing those audiences. So I'm going to be thinking about an academic audience for our work and thinking about traditional academic channels for publishing. But if you've got an academic audience, who is that audience? We've got a little saying in Manchester that we all kind of say to each other, which is, find your tribe. In other words, find the particular group of people that you can speak to and who can speak back to you. Who are the people who are particularly going to be interested in your research and read your research, and whose research do you want to read up? Wow, one of the problems for us in ICT4D research, what we can sometimes call the academic subdiscipline of development informatics, is of course it is a kind of a love child of many other broader disciplines. Many of you will be sitting in some of these individual disciplines, and so to some extent you'll have a sense of your audience. But even within these particular areas, these tend to be huge. You know, economics is a vast discipline, development studies is a vast discipline. All of these are very large disciplines as well. So it's not enough, I think, to say, oh, well, this particular discipline is my tribe. Yeah, your tribe may be within that particular discipline, but you've probably got to narrow down to think of probably a group at most of, I don't know, 2 dozen or 3 dozen people that you're particularly wanting to speak to and who are going to be interested in your work. And the point about finding them is finding ways to connect with them. I'll give an example of one of our doctoral students who was working on information systems and outsourcing. And he just by chance found a conference, went along to it, and he realized that this was a regular series of annual conferences, by pure coincidence, I'm sure, all held in the winter in very nice skiing resorts, and a group of about 2 dozen academics organised those conferences and always went to those conferences. They were the core audience, always at those conferences. He got in there, they were interested in his work, and then he'd found his tribe. And he went along to those conferences all the time. And of course, it wasn't purely a matter that these people were interested in his work. These also were the people, because many of them were senior academics, these were the people who were going to be refereeing articles in this particular topic area of information systems and outsourcing. And even though refereeing is supposed to be anonymous, at the very least, they would be interested in this particular topic area. They would be interested to try and promote articles in that area. And at the most, they might recognize the work as having been presented earlier at a conference. So he readily found himself getting supportive references and finding it easier to get published. So that's the kind of very instrumental basis for this notion of finding your tribe. Now, if you can't find your tribe, can you actually kind of create that? As an example, recently I've been running a network called Diode, Development Implications of Digital Economies. And that was a group of about 60 people, maybe around 3 or 4 dozen academics, all with specific interests in digital economies and developing countries. They're going to form a tribe for particular work I'm going to be doing in future around the digital economy, particularly around digital labour. They're people who are going to be interested in that work, they're going to read, they're going to take note of the work, and also maybe they may also end up kind of refereeing grant applications, journal applications, and so forth. So the point is, if you're struggling to find your tribe, maybe you can actually create it. Now, for PhD students, that might think, oh, well, gosh, that's completely impossible. How could I do that? But I would argue it's completely possible. You can start with something as simple as a Facebook group. You can fairly easily start to draw people together into a network. You can enlist more senior academics. Maybe you can get some funding to actually create a network that will bring together people in a workshop, creating a research agenda. You can go as far as creating special issues. So, anyone got any thoughts about this idea of the audience for our research in ICT4D? Any comments or any thoughts about that notion of finding your audience? Or who that audience is or should be? Yeah.
My experience has been that as a researcher in ICT4D, the minute they see the D, you're relegated to development forms of publication channels. Even though the topic or the subject of discussion could actually fit in STS, the field in which I locate myself, such as the Journal of Science and Human Values, for example, no, you should go consider development journals. So if you talk about finding your audience and finding your tribe, sometimes you're rejected just because of the D, the nature of your research. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I agree. I always remember kind of first 10 years of my career always being the last paper in the conference to be presented, the last chapter in the book. Yeah, so always with that. So I mean, the first thing to say is things have got a lot easier because we now actually have a sub-discipline. We have our own journals, we have our own conferences, we have our own networks, specifically in ICT4D. So we do have channels and outlets that are specifically interested in what we're doing. Then we've got the issue of what do you do in the wider disciplinary areas. I would argue that in development studies and also in informatics, there's an increasing increasing recognition of the role of either of ICTs within the development process or of, we can call them developing countries, we can call them emerging markets. So in both of those disciplines, I would say there's an increasing space to allow for those kinds of publications. In other areas, then maybe it's a question of how you actually frame what you're doing. And maybe it's a question there of reframing what you're doing in terms of some of the key debates, some of the key issues within that discipline. The challenge of that is you're kind of denying your developmentness by doing that. But then that's a decision you've got to make, and it comes back to that question of who's your audience? Who are you trying to reach out to? If you're going for science and technology studies, for instance, well, who are you trying to reach there? Is there actually a tribe, an audience for your work within science and technology studies? If there isn't, if they're telling you, we're not interested, this isn't an issue for us, then I guess you'd have to start reflecting on whether that is the right place to try to be publishing your research, or whether you should be looking for other places to find the people who are actually interested in what you're doing. Yeah, anybody else got comments or thoughts about the audience for our research? Please.
Isn't it, this is just an advice maybe or something, isn't it better to look at the papers that are published by proceedings of certain conference or journals, and that does this help in identifying your audience and seeing whether your research is suitable for this dissemination?
Absolutely. I mean, of course, the first thing we always do as well is we look at, if we're writing a paper, who have we referenced? That, of course, gives us a clue to that. And I'm sure one thing we all do is we go and, I mean, we were just talking about it before the start, about we try out conferences, don't we? And we see, how does my work go down? Were there 3 people in the session, or were there 300 people in the session? Were they engaged, or were they actually there for somebody else? Those kinds of things. We're kind of constantly probing, constantly trying out different avenues, different audiences for our work, and finding what's the kind of reaction we're getting, and hopefully getting that feeling of, yeah, wow, now I've found the people that I want to be with. Now, I mean, it's relatively easy for us to just stick in this field because we have our own conferences, because we have our own journals now in the field of development informatics. It's relatively easy now to stay in that. And I'm guessing we all have the experiences of going to these kind of conferences and feeling, oh yeah, there are people here who are really interested. I suppose the question for us is, do we actually want to try to reach out into the broader and more powerful disciplines, academic disciplines, in order to try and engage an audience in those wider disciplines? But again, that comes back to that initial point about intention. What's your purpose about publishing? Why are you publishing? What do you want to do with the particular item that you're publishing? And that, again, will guide you in terms of what audience you might pick. Okay, what I'm going to ask you to do is actually a little exercise now. If you wouldn't mind kind of either pairing up or finding yourself in a 3, whatever's convenient, as you are seated, and just talk with your neighbour about who is the audience for your research. Who do you think? I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be out of this map. Who's the audience for your research? How do you know that that's the audience for your research as well? I'm going to ask us to come back into sort of plenary. Anybody got any thoughts or any comments kind of arising out of what they've been discussing about who they feel is the audience? I know everybody will have their own individual answers, no doubt, but anything that came up around who you feel is the audience for ICT4D research? Gentleman at the back.
I have a comment from Joseph Davis Wetty. I hope we are open to do research business as well, other than only academic audience. So my audience would be business people.
But then my question would be, I did say up front that my experience and the focus will certainly be on academic research. But then the question would be, how do you reach that audience then? You know, which is what we're gonna obviously come on to in a second, is thinking about the C. One thing I would say is I don't think we're particularly good at thinking about and knowing about how to reach out to those kinds of audiences. Certainly the projects I'm involved in, very often it's, we'll have a strategy brief, we'll have a policy brief. But I'm not sure we're particularly good at thinking about what the content of those should be and how specifically we should disseminate them. Some of us, we have a team in Manchester, some of us are fortunate enough to have full-time professional communications teams who can do the kind of translation work of translating academic research into briefings and finding the kind of right content, format, channels, and so on. If you're fortunate to have that in your institution, that's great, because they can help to push over those messages to practice, business, policy audiences, and so on. For the rest of us, as I say, we do have one at Manchester, but for the rest, it can be difficult, and I think it does require more thought in terms of thinking about how we reach across to those sorts of audiences. Okay, thanks for that, Edgar. All right, so, John, please.
We had an interesting discussion here, and we explored different avenues, but we also mentioned something somehow controversial, that for some of our work, the audience is the journal itself. And once it gets there, it sits there.
So that's certainly something I'm going to come on and talk more about, the fact that, it's what do we do after publication? I absolutely agree with that. Okay, any other points people wanted to raise about your discussions?
We also had another point here about how sometimes the community that is probably the best to publish and disseminate from a career perspective, from an academic view, is not the one that you most relate to. So in my case, I often felt this tension between, I know where I should be publishing to get the high impact points and the thing, but I really don't like those group of people there and the whole culture of research there. Whereas the conferences and groups, there's a small groups that are academics all over the world working on the topic, they don't have that weight. So you are torn between these two.
I mean, unfortunately, of course, we all know the solution is which you have to double up. You know, you have to do both things at once. And I know very often, particularly if I don't know for those of you who are in academic departments where you're sitting, but I'm particularly aware of it with colleagues who are in business schools, that that marginalisation of the 4D has made it quite difficult for some of them, unless they're particularly kind of clever and entrepreneurial at working out how to, or confident about how to work that into their work, that they publish in the mainstream high-ranked journals, and then they do what they kind of think of as their pro bono work almost, which is going out to the conferences where they'll engage with the kinds of audiences that they really want to talk to. But the problem of that is, of course, you're doubling up your workload, therefore, in terms of the amount of time that it takes you to reach out to those two different kind of audiences, which, of course, have those two different intentions. One is the, how do I get ahead in my career, and the other one is, how do I actually put a message across to those that I really want to get across to. The other thing I would, though, slightly say, and thinking about some of the kind of most successful high-flying academics, so the Jeff Walshams of this world, they've had the confidence to make an argument to mainstream academic audiences, to make an argument that says, for example, well, development matters, or particular ideas matter, or we need to understand this emerging phenomenon in the world, and have actually created an audience for their work in those mainstream disciplines. So it can be done, but I think it's almost a lifetime's project, and you have to have that confidence to say, I'm going to keep pushing at that door, I'm going to keep making an argument, and also to understand enough about the discipline that you've got the kind of the language to understand how you put across an argument that says what we find around ICTs in developing countries is particularly significant and interesting for you in your particular discipline, say in organizational management studies. There's something for you to learn here that you wouldn't perhaps otherwise have recognized. And it comes back to not just recognizing your audience, but framing what you're saying in terms of the language of that audience. Kind of brings me then on to the next point of the, or the next one of the little acronyms, which is thinking about your message. What is the specific message that you want to communicate, which we often just boil down to, after someone's read your work, what do you want them to think differently and about what compared to how they were before you read your work? Really trying to boil it down very, very simply to that elevator pitch. So often certainly when I'm reviewing papers, there is no elevator pitch there. It's really not clear what the message of the paper was, or it's confused. Again, I said I'm reviewing a set of papers at the moment. A number of them, they're trying to ride two horses at once. So, for example, they say, well, the contribution of this paper is that we're going to advance the ideas about critical realist methodology, and also we're going to say something new about ICTs and education. You can't really do that effectively. Particularly the pressure to make journal papers fairly short as well. You can't do that effectively, kind of try to ride two horses. So thinking about the single message that you're trying to get across in your paper and putting that across and constantly coming back to that as you're writing to think, have I put the message across? Is what I'm writing relevant to that message or not? I hadn't put this into the discussion, but one of the most useful techniques that I use is reverse outlining, which is when you've written your work, go through it again as a reader and write a set of notes on your work as if you were a reader. You know the classic problem with most written work is that the author doesn't see it from the perspective of the reader. That's the number one problem. That's why we do refereeing, by looking at work from the perspective of the reader. So, as an author, what you would say to yourself is, how can I turn myself into a reader? How can I read my work from a reader's perspective? And reverse outlining is a great technique for doing that, because you are reading your piece of work and you're taking notes on it just like a reader. So I always do reverse outlining with my work. Once I've written a draft, wait a few days. I know not often easy because one's often working up against deadlines, but if you plan ahead, wait a few days and then come back to it and do a reverse outlining. It's such a useful, such a powerful technique, because you will so readily see, well, hang on, the main message of my piece was X. What is this paragraph doing in my paper? Because it has got nothing to do with X. I've put it in because I thought it was interesting, or I came up with some notes, or I really feel that it should be in there, but it's got nothing to do with the main message, and out it goes. And you'll also see kind of dangling arguments, something that you trailed at the beginning of the paper and, never came back to it at the end. So either I've got to come back to it, I've got to remove it from the start. You see things that are in the wrong place, restructuring. It is reverse outlining. I cannot recommend it highly enough as a technique for honing your message, reducing the length of your paper, making sure it's focused, and that it has a clear flow of argument. Maybe it's a particular bugbear of mine, but when I review articles, so often they do not have a flow of argument. It's just staccato, a point, then a completely different point, then a different point, then another different point. There's no flow. And what you need to be doing is handing the reader on from one bit to the next bit to the next bit, and so on. And again, reverse outlining is very powerful for doing that. So, message, getting that elevator pitch, thinking very clearly about what you want to say in your article, having that, sometimes I will put it up on the wall and just keep looking up at it to think, is what I'm writing relevant to get that message across? Once you've got that message, you have to think about what's the channel that you're going to use in order to reach your chosen audience. Now, I fully admit I'm a little over-obsessed with citations, and I realize there are many critiques about citations. However, they are a relatively good proxy for the quality and the impact of our research, so they can tell us something useful. So a few years ago, when I was uncertain about there are so many different places to publish, what should we do? I did this, which is I just basically analysed all of my publications in terms of the type of channel, and then in terms of the number of mean and median citations per item, and the percentage of items that had never been cited. If you're ever feeling depressed, you can just take a look at that. I've done more than 100 conference presentations, more than 90% of them never been cited. What did I learn from that? The most effective, in terms of citations, which I know has limitations, but the most effective way of getting a message out is the single-authored book. But, of course, that typically requires a very great deal amount of work, and you might ask yourself, as I sometimes have, do I do a book, or do I do kind of 4 or 6 journal articles, which probably takes around the same amount of time.
You don't have edited volumes?
Well, no, I don't. That's right. You mean that would be me as editor? Yeah. No, I haven't put those there. Because as the editor, it's not your work. It's not your work that's being cited. It's the chapters within the work that are actually being cited there. So I don't count that. However, let me put the trouble is there are 2 contradictory arguments about to come out. The first one is, as a result of writing this, I've never again done any book chapters. I realise book chapters, they're about the same amount of effort as a refereed journal article, but in general, they are far less highly cited. However, that is true that being the editor of a book, you will tend to get that book cited, even if you haven't even written a chapter in the book, which is pretty unfair, but there we go. At least you may be getting some ideas out that you wish to. How much work it is being a book chapter editor very much varies. Personally, I think it is a huge amount of work and pretty close to writing a book. But that depends on your editorial style. My editorial style is highly interventionist. I pretty much end up rewriting every one of the chapters in edited books that I do in order to bring them up to what I regard as a decent standard. I mean, that's me. So there are 2 contradictory messages. The editor, great idea. As the contributor, I'm not sure they are a particularly good idea. Journal articles in top journals beat journal articles in not top journals, and conference papers hardly create a ripple. So by all means, I kind of concluded from this, go to conferences in order to network, in order to get drunk in an exotic location, in order to maybe try out an idea, but don't think that your actual conference paper and presentation are going to have a really significant impact. Varies, of course, depends on the conference. More technical conferences tends to be somewhat better, but the idea that going to a conference and your presentation is somehow going to change the world, academically, probably not so. Anyone got any kind of issues, anything to raise about this idea of the different impacts of the different channels? Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, sure. Yeah. When you write a book, how do you find the publisher? First thing I'd say is if the publisher finds you, you ought to be a little bit careful. Because sometimes these days, as I'm sure we're all aware, there are kind of plenty of scam publishers, or not even scam publishers, just kind of basic business model publishers that, we've come across your PhD, it's a fantastic piece of work, I'm sure you'd like to get it published, and it'll only cost you $1,000 and so forth. $1,000 if you're lucky. It would come back to that same point, I think, about finding your tribe. Looking and seeing who has published a book that looks similar to what I'm doing. But I think also you've got to be very careful about, again, coming back to what's your intent, what's your purpose, going right back to the beginning. If you're thinking about a book, say from your PhD, what is the purpose of doing that? I know one of my colleagues who got her PhD published as a book, and I remember chatting to her about, kind of how are sales going, and it had sold 50 copies, I think, something like that. Now you might argue that the amount of work for converting a PhD to a book is not so great, but it was probably at least as great as writing 2 journal articles, and she would have had more impact writing those 2 journal articles. So I think you've got to be a little bit careful. There is a whole spectrum of publishers, and there are some who are kind of, that I won't name, but are quite legitimate publishers, but actually they're just there to kind of on the knowledge that a few libraries will buy a copy of a book, but will anybody ever really read it? I think you've got to be quite cautious about that. And if you're with a reputable publisher, you'll obviously have to put in a book proposal, and that will include a whole bunch of questions about who is the market, who is the audience for this book, and realistically who's going to adopt it and how many copies are going to get sold. And also, if they're in any way a legitimate publisher, that proposal is going to go out to a couple of referees who will look at that with a very steely eye and say, I'm sure your PhD is jolly interesting, but frankly it is not going to get adopted as a core textbook by development studies or computer science courses, and therefore probably for the publisher they need to think very carefully about going ahead with it. Okay.
Question on that. There is an emerging trend, if I may call it that way. It's probably old trend now, but I was at Trinity for 2 years and we had a big debate about this, inclusive of course, about Twitter, YouTube and all that. A lot of academics are now using those channels, and some school of thought believe that those should be considered. For example, the downloads of their work on YouTube, the retweets of their work, and the likes. And I don't know what your take is on that.
I probably shouldn't say this, but our comms team come to our monthly meetings, and they're all full of kind of, we had 8,000 retweets this week, we had and you kind of want to say that you said, guys, none of this is real. But, I'm sure there's much more knowledge about this in the room than there is from me. I think my view would be that you probably get out what you put in with these kinds of things. It seems to me that the most successful academics in social media terms properly commit to it. They really spend time every day on social media. They do the podcasts, they do the vlogs, they do the blogging, and they really engage as well. Not just a kind of one-way dissemination, but retweeting and discussing and really finding things online. But where's the time for that? If you do that an hour a day, that's an hour a day you're not spending writing a journal article, sleeping. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mine goes to some publication venues, and I saw work in them. And if I'm right, each and every year there is a list where you can find what they call predatory journals and publication house each and every year this list is put out, and I'm asking myself who is ranking those journals and publication houses for the journals.
Yeah, I mean
Still,
yeah, sure.
still, even if there is out each and every year, people still continue to publish in those journals and papers. And my question is this one. Is every researcher able to publish in high-ranked journals?
No.
Like, just continue ranking or tagging journals and publication houses as predatory and what? While when you look at some of the works published in those journals are really quite good. What's your take on that?
I think there's two slightly different things here. One is about the whole notion of ranking, and the other is about kind of predatory journals who will just, you can tell them, can't you? They've just picked, they've just put a whole load of words into a hat and then they just pulled them out at random. The American Journal of International Social Studies and Research, or something like that. So I would certainly not recommend having any truck with predatory journals. But there are plenty of lower ranked journals that one can publish in. And I think, okay, in fact, that was going to be my next point, was about thinking about the particular journal outlets that we publish in. Again, I don't know your particular departments, whether you have kind of the white lists of required journals that you must publish in. Some academic disciplines and departments have that, or kind of blacklisting of, well, don't publish in anything below what we would call in the UK terms 3 stars. I'm guessing many of you will be familiar with this, which is the ABS ranking which covers kind of it's the Association of Business Schools, covers business and management journals mainly, but also does include some broader variety, and that gives at least a UK perspective on how good in our 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, 4-star terms a journal is. That doesn't cover ICT4D, and it doesn't cover development studies, which is why I did this journal ranking myself of development studies, I did this actually to find out where do the ICT4D journals sit in relation to development studies overall, because my colleagues had never heard of I'm in a development studies department, so my colleagues had not heard of these journals, and I wanted to give at least some sense for them of calibration. 2 things I learned from this. First of all, the ICT4D journals are not an embarrassment. They're mid-table in terms of how they would rank. And 3 journals are the journals in ICT for development. I'm sure you know them: Information Technology for Development, Information Technologies and International Development, and the Electronic Journal of Information Systems in developing countries. So in terms of where one would think about publishing, if you want to publish in ICT4D, if you have an ICT4D audience, you can go for one of those. And there are, there's others. Information development seems to be surprisingly very little known as a journal, but is very much publishing in our area. It historically comes out of a library studies, but publishing there. And there are a number of other journals that will be lower down still. The African Journal of Information Systems. If you want to go online to the blog, there's a whole list of, I think these days there's about 15 ICT4D journals, none of which are predatory journals, and all of which would allow you to publish into them. But then you've got the question of deciding, well, what quality journal do I go for? As I showed on the last slide, publishing the impacts of your work in terms of citations, but just in terms of kind of influence and how much it matters, obviously depends on the specific content of your paper, not the journal. However, having said that, the very same paper published in a high-ranked journal will have more impact, more citations than that very same paper published in a low-ranked journal, simply because of reasons of sort of access and kudos of the journal and so forth. And I think in general terms, a little kind of message that we tell ourselves, certainly reflecting on impact, is if you've got 6 months, it's better to spend that 6 months writing one article for a high-quality journal than, say, 3 articles for mediocre journals. You'll have more influence, and of course, coming back to the points about career progression and so on, then that matters as well. Then we would come on to the question of, well, how do I get into a high-quality journal? That, of course, is phenomenally difficult to do, and it's generally a long process. You have to start by being a reviewer yourself, for example, not necessarily for a high-ranked journal, but just doing reviews, because there's nothing better than doing a review. It's like the broader equivalent of reverse outlining. It's how you understand how journal papers are constructed and what's good and what's bad. So being a reviewer is enormously useful in terms of improving your own quality. And then you can look online if you want to look at the REF criteria, the Research Excellence Framework criteria for originality, significance, and rigor. It will tell you, well, what is a 1-star, a 2-star, a 3-star, and a 4-star paper. But essentially, the difference is those 3 things that I'm going to come on to talk to in a little bit. Rigor of your work, the originality of your work, and the significance of your work. And pushing up all of those 3 and thinking about those 3 and asking yourself, how can I improve the rigor? How can I improve the originality? How can I improve the significance? All of those matter. And the other thing, of course, is either to get yourself a co-author who's already got experience of publishing into those journals, or get one of those kinds of people to read your work as well and give you some feedback on it. Sorry, Edgar, I guess somebody else has been trying to ask a question.
We have one more question
Yeah.
from the online comment. How does the medium of transmitting the research message affect its integrity and authenticity? And what should a researcher really be worried of in the process of spreading the information? And the comment is about Mike. So if someone has to ask a question here, then I'll have to...
Oh, sorry, or I should repeat it. Sorry, yeah, fine.
I would also like to acknowledge the presence of Silko, who has been driving ICT4D at ESP. You're welcome.
That's an interesting question, isn't it? The kind of the old the medium is the message and what you put across. I'm not going to attempt to answer that question because it would need someone in probably communication studies to be able to answer it. But I guess it comes back to the point that the media, the channels that you choose, send a particular message about the type of work that you are doing. Okay, fine. Anyone else got any points they wanted to raise about, the channel?
What's your opinion on open source and this kind of stuff?
I think you've got to. Okay, first of all, I think the views on open source are changing. So out of these, as you probably know, EJISDC and ITID are both open source. In general. In general, if something's open source, of course, you're likely to have more readers, which is what we all want, which is a good thing. But, of course, at the moment, the highest quality journals are not available as open source. Again, I don't know what your institutions are like. In the UK now, we are mandated that there must be an open source version of everything that we publish. So we're kind of getting the best of both worlds at the moment, that everybody can, with access to the web, can get access to our work, but we also get the kudos and not just the kudos, the value of publishing in a high quality journal. Okay, thanks for that. Yeah.
One question. You mentioned that the publishing in conferences.
Yeah.
You never get too much citations. What about these top conferences? I'm in the area of information systems. Sure, I have done some research in ICT4D. European conference, information system, international conference have a very low rate of acceptance. Your paper is there. And my experience is that is for American conference. Citation you got also from and many citations in my case, I could say, in 2010.
So the question was about kind of that some conferences you may get higher levels of citation. Yeah, so I did say that some more technical conferences, and probably I'm reflecting my own conference background, which is not to have got into the top quality IS conferences. Yeah, I think if you go in with those very high quality ones, I mean certainly ISIS, ESIS are regarded as the equivalent of a 3-star journal article in terms of the quality of the papers. And also, because of that high quality, then they would tend to get a decent level of citations. So that probably comes back to picking and choosing your particular conferences.
And by the way, one question is that if on ICT4D, don't try to be part, as a track in this top conference. In some cases it is, in some cases not. Because if you find yourself as a track, then you are attracting more quality. I could say you have the chances to attract quality paper, very high quality paper. I'm not so sure we have published. I think we're a student in this ICT4D a long time ago, but I think here is the chances are greater to have quality papers.
So you're advocating trying to have tracks, ICT4D tracks in top conferences.
So one conference is not enough for having, I'm sure that there are a lot of research done around, but I would say that this top conference may attract the attention of other researchers to publish and to try to publish high quality papers in this one.
Certainly in information systems, there's a group of researchers, Sandeep Sahai, Jeff Walsh, and those kinds of people who've made, and many others, who've made very specific attempts to raise the profile of ICT4D within their discipline, running tracks in those kinds of conferences, organizing special issues. Because of the rejection rates and the refereeing processes in the conferences and the journals, ensuring that only high quality ICT4D items are accepted, and therefore raising the profile and the reputation of ICT4D within those disciplines. So I agree that they've done that, but of course they've done that, if you like, from a position of power within those disciplines, having been firmly rooted in those disciplines and able to, when they suggest to an editor, let's run a special issue on this, that the editors would say yes rather than saying no. But I agree that's been very positive, and it's certainly something to think of, going back to that disciplinary diagram, certainly something to think of if you've got that kind of position within an academic discipline. Rigor, I'm not going to say too much about. I straddle ICT4D straddles information systems and development studies, and I've been very struck by the different approaches to rigor in those two disciplines. At the same time as I was trying to minutely defend the data gathering, the conceptualization, the methodology, the research philosophy of an article in information systems, I was aware that a paper that I was refereeing that had no conceptualization, no real methodology, was very likely to be accepted in a top development studies journal. So the first thing is that standards of rigor seem to vary quite a lot between disciplines. But the other thing that always strikes me with papers that I'm reviewing is you really should have thought about this earlier. That papers that clearly do not have rigorous data gathering, they've not really thought things through, they've clearly rushed too quickly into fieldwork. And it's a reminder, we've got a project on at the moment we're just starting in South Africa, and I'm trying to kind of slow us as much as I possibly can to say, let's really think through how this is, particularly thinking through, how is this going to look when it comes to publication? And we're having to defend, why did you interview those people and not those people? What was the basis on which you developed your interview schedule? What was your specific methodology that you chose, and why did you choose it? How was that consistent with your conceptualization? All of those kinds of questions that a reviewer would ask, really trying to think through them at the beginning. But reflecting so many research projects I've been involved in, we've kind of rushed that stage and we've gone on far too quickly. So just a kind of plea to slow up at that stage and really force yourself, particularly with a group of people, to think through how is this going to look when it comes to publication, and how are we going to show that we have been rigorous and that what we're trying to claim in our work is valid. Originality can mean, I think, innovation in one of up to three things: the topic that you're looking at, the frame that you're using for analysis, and your research methods. In practice, I think it's often the research topic that we try to use in order to get the originality, and that would mean being the first or being one of the first to publish on an emerging phenomenon or an emerging issue. And timing there seems to be so critical. If I look at the kind of work that I have done, timing seems to be a key differentiator of impact. So, for instance, I've done what I thought was very good work on introducing actor network theory into development studies. It made barely a ripple, basically because it was kind of 20 or 30 years too late. If I'd have been wanting to do that, I should have been doing it at the early days of actor network theory in the 80s, possibly in the 90s, but it was just out of time as a focus. Managed to get rejected from all the three top development journals. Not, I think, really because of the quality of the work, but just because of the fact that it was the wrong topic at the wrong time. Conversely, as an example, I've done work which is really not very good at all. One that always comes to mind is a working paper I did in 1999 on ICT's poverty and development. It was just a dump bin for a set of little ideas, notes that weren't really connected together at all, but very highly cited, very widely used. Why? Because it was the very first paper on that topic. So kind of timing seems to be everything, at least in terms of impact and in terms of citation. Now, of course, for those of us working in ICTs and development, in general, we're likely to be looking at some fairly new phenomenon. But we've got to kind of calibrate ourselves, I think, to the window of relevance. That notion of the window of relevance came home to us this year. We've got a PhD student who wants to look at agriculture and ICTs in Africa. And we started off saying, oh, look at precision agriculture. It's a really kind of sexy topic. People are really starting to talk about it, sort of hype about it, really, really interesting. Meaning use of sensors and drones and so on in smallholder farming in Africa. Big problem, though, there just isn't any actual experience with that as yet on the ground. It's a great idea. There might be a couple of experiments with large-scale companies, but in terms of actual implementation on the ground, it's just not there. It's too far ahead of the curve. You need to come back in 3 to 5 years' time in order to make that an effective topic. Okay, so we say, all right, so we'll move down the window of relevance. Let's look at mobiles and agriculture. Problem with mobiles and agriculture, there's already an awful lot being written about that. It becomes increasingly difficult to find a new niche to research in that topic area. Now, of course, there are definitely niches that you could find. There's always a niche, I think, in ICT4D research for doing good quantitative research, because there is so little good quantitative research in our domain. But nonetheless, we kind of felt, no, that's kind of, it's a bit been there, done that as a topic area. So then we kind of moved it back up a little bit and said, well, look at new web and smartphone enabled business models. And that's where she's ended up kind of in the middle of the window of relevance. Not so bleeding edge that there's no experience out there that one can actually research. Not so kind of old hat that there's a great deal of research already being done, but that sweet spot somewhere in the middle. And she's now researching digital platforms in agriculture in Africa. We could also look at other types of originality. For example, can we bring a new research framework to bear on our work? That's really, I think, a question of feeling out the academic fads and fashions. So as an obvious example, institutional logics these days is flavour of the month as an idea, and you can bet that if you use that in your research, you might find a relatively easier path to publication. In a few years' time, it will be passé. I have to say, though, I used to be quite kind of theory-driven in terms of research and saying, the way that we're going to be original and innovative in our research is picking something that nobody's picked before. Actor network theory was not such a great idea, but back a few years ago, let's be the first to use the livelihoods approach, let's be the first to use the capabilities approach. I was quite keen on that. I'm becoming less keen on that, and actually these days much more keen on being problem-driven. Looking at how ICTs are engaging with development, looking at the emergent problems, and saying, what's the development problem that is emerging? That's where we're going to get our originality from. That's what we should be researching. And we will bring in our methods, we will bring in our framework in order to address that emergent problem, that emergent topic, rather than being framework or methods driven. It's the same in methods these days. Yeah, everybody's into data science and big data at the moment, but it's a bit of a I've got a hammer now, where are the nails type of approach to ICT4D research. Much better, I think, as I say, to focus on the topic area, the problem, the development problem. I think thinking of your work by saying, what's the development problem that my research is trying to solve? I think that gives you a great deal of clarity in terms of your focus. So I'd like to move, thinking of that originality, to another little discussion, if you wouldn't mind. Discuss with your neighbour what is the originality in your research that you're doing? Where's it coming from? What is original about the research that you are doing? Okay, if I could draw us back together again. Anybody got any generic points that they wish to raise as a result of having talked about the originality of their research, reflecting on that? Yeah.
Related to a topic is the most important one. And then the rest is coming like, okay, maybe originality could come from the frame method, but it doesn't matter too much. The problem is very important. And
can I just ask, you say a research problem. Do you see that as meaning the same thing as a development problem?
No. I was saying that what the research, academic research has been doing till now, and you find that it's a lack or it is really a problem in that.
Okay, so those are two slightly different things, aren't there? One is the sort of, so the research problem is the knowledge gap, isn't it? Yeah, that's fine. Then that's slightly different, isn't there, from the development problem? The fact that too many people who are blind in the world can't get an income-generating livelihood, or those sorts of things. So ideally, what you need to be doing is marrying those two things together, isn't it? At the very top is probably the development problem, and then out of that, what's the knowledge gap in relation to that development problem? And that then, therefore, of course, absolutely, yeah, then that gives the originality to your work. Sorry, was there another point you wanted to?
remember why quantitative research is so less in the ICT4D. That could be a question, probably due to the fact that you collect the data through surveys or get to organization, or it is a lack of responding to the survey from the organization. I remember most of the studies are looking to qualitative research methods, and this we are doing most of the time. It requires a lot of time.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question of why there's that lack of quantitative research.
Have you found that, or?
I think there's a bit of a dangerous circularity, isn't it? If you look at quite a number of the sort of leading people in ICT4D research, they are qualitative researchers. And so that kind of then sets a culture, which then replicates in terms of PhD students and reviewers and what gets published and so on. So I think that's quite problematic to break that. In terms of then the difficulty or otherwise of doing the research, it probably depends. Quantitative field research, yeah, then you need to obviously go out there and get your surveys. But getting survey responses I wouldn't see as necessarily any more difficult than getting a set of decent interviews. And of course, with big data, it's becoming increasingly possible to do quantitative ICT4D research without ever leaving the comfort of your own armchair. So the possibilities certainly, I think, are growing. And I'd hope that I always wished I could have been a quantitative researcher, and if I had my time again, I'd do it. Yeah, they're right. The Jeff Walsham and Chrysanthi Avgeru and Kentaro Toyama's that's right. Yeah. If you look at kind of, I don't know, keynote speakers at ICT4D conferences, they are rarely quantitative researchers. Yeah. Any other points people want to raise about originality of topic? Okay, then the last bit of CROS was significance, of which I'm going to mention three somewhat disconnected things. In terms of trying to increase the significance of the research that we're doing. The first question would be, is there some kind of debate or disagreement that you could get in the way of as part of your research? Because people are always engaged with those sorts of things, and therefore if your research is contributing to that, it will tend to have a greater significance. One of the great disappointments I have in ICT4D research is I'm really struggling to see where the debates and disagreements are. I remember I put a note on the ICT4D Facebook group last year saying, what do we disagree about? I mean, maybe you've got some better ideas than me, but I really struggle to understand that. In other disciplines, there are kind of virulent disagreements about particular topics. People who hate each other because they're on different sides of a debate. We just don't seem to have that in ICT4D. I was kind of thinking we ought to manufacture some in order to at least bring... And I didn't know whether that was reflective of a positive within the domain, the fact that we seem to sort of have a general agreed sense of how to approach the topic, or whether it's actually a very negative sign that there aren't these vibrant disagreements within our area. But if you can get your research focused on some kind of debate, even if it's taken from outside the domain, the ICT4D domain, then that can help to increase the significance. A particular differentiator of this sort of 4-star, 3-star, 2-star, 1-star research is the breadth. What's the widest scope of discussion that your work can try to address? I sum this up in a rather kind of simplistic way of saying, where does the country appear in the title of your work? If the country appears right at the start, so Indian IT industry development and import liberalisation, you're essentially limiting your audience, you're limiting your scope to say, I'm only interested in this country. That's all I'm talking about here. If you move the country after the colon, import liberalisation and IT industry development, the case of India, you're broadening the scope somewhat. You're saying, well, I'm looking at one particular country, but it's illustrative of a wider discussion. So you've still got some sort of sense of narrowing, but you're trying to broaden it at all. Then if you've got no mention of the country whatsoever, import liberalisation and IT industry development, you're kind of aiming for the widest scope possible. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that everybody now goes out and drops the name of the country from the title of their paper. My point is, this is illustrating the focus of your paper.
I did that once.
Yes.
With one of my papers, and it's taken several years for people to find it.
Okay, then you need maybe to roll back and to go for that rather than that. Well, I'll come on and talk about dissemination in just a second. But for me, whenever I'm reviewing a paper, I will look at where the country comes in the title, because I always think it helps to give me a guide to the ambition of the person who is writing. So as an example, I recently had to review a paper, I think it was for an environmental journal, on Indian e-waste policy. And the paper was entitled something like Indian e-waste policy. That was probably just about it. And it was just about Indian e-waste policy. So I wrote back to the authors and say, who do you think is going to read this paper? How many people do you imagine? How many environment studies academics have a specific interest in Indian e-waste policy? Yeah, sure, by all means. We know India's a very large country and a bellwether and a leading example to some extent, and so on and so forth. But it was actually about the very specific technicalities of a particular set of clauses in the paper and how they might be changed. There would be practically nobody would read that paper. They needed to significantly increase the breadth, the scope, the ambition of the paper, and start off by talking about e-waste policy overall, maybe e-waste policy overall in developing countries, what are some of the key knowledge gaps that exist, and how their work on India might be illustrative of those wider debates. If that is, they wanted their paper to have greater influence and to be more significant. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they weren't really bothered. But if you want to have your paper to have greater significance, then you need to do that. And then dissemination. I'm always amazed when I talk to my colleagues about their approaches to dissemination of their work and how many of them think that their work ends once their paper has been published. That's it. Fine, they'll just move on to the next paper. That leaves me absolutely speechless. That's completely crazy. That's when the hard work starts all over again with your paper once it has been published, because you have to disseminate it. My assumption is that most of us feel fairly good about what we publish. We believe in it to some extent. If you don't, why are you publishing? If you believe in what you publish to some extent, why would you not want the maximum number of people to be aware of your paper and to read that paper? But if you want the maximum number of people to be aware of and read your paper, you have to do a really decent job of dissemination. The illustration one can, or the image I think one can use in this case is the idea of the flotilla rather than the boat. First of all, meaning rather than just being a single aircraft carrier of your journal article, you have a whole host of other things around it. That it will first of all have been a seminar or a conference presentation, that it will have been a working paper, that there will be an open access version, that it will be a tweet, that it will be a blog, that it will be a podcast, that it will be a teaching session, that it will be a video, that it will be a magazine article, etc., etc. All of which are about pushing that message across in multiple different channels, potentially each one reinforcing messages or reaching different audiences. Another part of the kind of notion of the flotilla, not the boat, is trying to get other people involved in pushing a particular message. Could be as simple as just getting co-authors on your paper, because then you'll be getting other people involved. But it could be up to organising a workshop around a particular topic, or if you're feeling kind of confident or you have the connections, maybe organising a special issue on a particular topic, because again, then you've got that flotilla and you've got that greater chance of influencing people and having significant research rather than just one little solo item. And then finally, dissemination in terms of sending round copies of your paper. Yeah, you can do it by email. I sometimes wonder these days if actually sending a physical copy would be so surprising and unusual for if you sent that round to people that you know would be interested in your work. It's very hit and miss, I know, dissemination. Most people won't look at an email message, or they wouldn't necessarily look at a hard copy, but you never know. You'll hit people who are just about to get on a flight to Stockholm or something like that, and they'll just think, oh, okay, I'll use that opportunity to read this paper, and then they'll be aware of your work. But whatever it is you do, whichever means you use to improve the dissemination of your paper, then I think it's something that we tend to neglect far too much. Anybody? Yeah, sure, please.
Dissemination seems to be like a marketing.
Yep.
For your product or in this
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
Which you consider from this point, or what the method you mentioned, or the ways you mentioned, the best, or it's a combination of them?
I haven't looked at it enough, and I'm not a marketing professional, but I think that's absolutely right. If you wanted to do it seriously, there's that? Is it a book? I can't remember, or was it an article? You know, the brand called me, or something like that, and thinking about yourself as a brand and how you market yourself. If you wanted to do it properly and professionally, you'd actually look into the proper marketing techniques of marketing, and think about how best to disseminate your work. Best technique I would recommend, live a long time. Then you kind of keep and stay in one area. Stay in one area. Don't you think? I mean, don't you think? Because some people, they'll kind of spend 3 years in this area, 3 years in that area, and so on, and keep moving around far too much. And it's kind of nobody knows. You don't really kind of build up that reputation. I should also say there's an incredibly long lag effect. I've not done eGov research for maybe 10 years, something like that, but I'm still getting, I had 2 this week of PhD students who say, oh, I know you're doing work in e-government, I want to come and do work in e-government, and so on. So keeping on going in a particular area over a long period of time, I think that's very much how you build up that. I mean, that's more kind of building up the brand, if you like, rather than the significance of a particular piece of research.
But I have a remark here. Sometimes you are forced to jump in another area due to the things that the projects might come from another area, and opportunities might come from another area.
No, I know, it's true. It's true. Yeah, I agree. It's really difficult, isn't it? The number of times you outline, right, this is my research project, this is the grant application I'm going to put in, this is the thing I'm going to look at for the next 5 years, and then 12 months' time it's all gone up in smoke because something else has kind of... Yeah, no, I agree. And what do you do in those circumstances? Do you sort of do the old J.K. Rowling, no, I've had 19 rejections, but I'm still going to carry on whatever, or do you say, oh, yeah, okay, this is an opportunity, and keep moving around? I think also it depends sort of what you see the overall area. I think we're quite lucky in ICT4D because there are not so many people. Of course, it's growing and it's fractionating and so on, but if you locate yourself in ICT4D, that can be your area for a lifetime's worth of work. And anything, ICT4D has got to be almost the perfect academic area, hasn't it? Because if you spin the clock forward, say 50 years, you know that over the course of that 50 years, developing countries, the populations are going to grow, they're going to become more powerful, more important in the world, and you know as well that ICT is going to have an ever-increasing and ever-changing role in the world. So it's almost a perfect academic location to be in, because constantly changing and growing, who could want better than that? I look at my poor colleagues, say, in the linguistics departments, for instance, and that is not a career track you would be recommending to anybody, at least in those sort of objective terms. Sorry, anybody else got any thoughts about dissemination, good practice, or significance of your work?
It was more to do with significance, and maybe this is just a semantic thing, but I was thinking, wouldn't the significance of one's research also have to do with how you feed it back to the community that you are researching in and how it impacts them? For example, if you are doing field work in developing countries, there are many methods that involve people to shape the design of the research. And so if journals aren't the best way to reach them, is there a way the significance of your work could be measured in terms of how have you impacted those lives and how they have taken forward your work?
As I said at the beginning again, I'm taking a kind of an academic focus on what I've been talking about today. There is a separate, we could redo the whole seminar, couldn't we? Taking a much more practitioner and policy-based line and thinking about what is it that engages policymakers, what is it engages business people at a strategic level, and how do we effectively make a change down in the communities. One positive thing I certainly see, it's true of UK research, and maybe that is representative of wider trends, is an increasing importance for the questions about the impact of our research. So as an example, this research excellence framework now includes, I think it's 25% weighting for impact of research. And we have to tell a series of impact stories about how the work that we've done has had a real world impact on changing a policy, creating a new business, addressing some of the SDGs, which I think, yeah, no, I absolutely see that as very important. But as I say, the focus of what I've been talking about today was more on the academic side of things. Okay, any other thoughts that people want to raise about significance or dissemination? So my last slide is just an illustration of CROS from a publication that, notwithstanding the later critiques of it, that I've always admired, which is Rob Jensen's piece on mobile phone use by Carroll and Fisherman, which I think probably can lay claim to be the most highly cited ICT4D paper. Why does it? I can't speak to his intention. I don't really know about it. But in terms of the other elements of it, audience, for example, he knows his tribe. He is an academic economist, and he wrote this paper for other academic economists. Later people have kind of criticized him, oh, he didn't do enough from a sociological perspective and so on. Well, no, he wasn't. That's not his discipline. He was writing, he knew who he wanted to write to, and he specifically focused on them. He had a very clear and evidence-based message, which was mobile phones make markets work better. Very clear, very simple elevator pitch that ran right through all of that paper. In terms of the channel, he chose a top-ranked 4-star economics journal through which to publish. That increased the reach, increased the perceived value, and through the rigor of its refereeing process, increased the quality of what he did. In terms of rigor, there's a rigorous quantitative foundation built on shed loads of longitudinal fieldwork data and rooted in welfare economics theory. In terms of originality, he got the timing exactly right. It was just at the point when people were starting to ask, well, we've had all this hype from the 2003, 2005 World Summits on the Information Society. We've got all of these investments in ICT. Has it all been a waste of money? Has it had any kind of effect? And he was able to come and demonstrate a positive contribution that ICTs were making to development. And finally, in terms of significance, because it uses a generalized theory, then even perhaps when we shouldn't do, people have extrapolated from this to other situations, other contexts, and so it's become a key paper in the field of ICT4D, both in terms of its findings, but also in terms of its methodology. So I'm hoping that in planning your own writing, you may very well bear in mind the CROS guidelines. We're going to do one final activity, but before we break for that, any general points or questions people like to raise? Yeah.
This paper was not providing a positive impact.
Yeah.
Let's say a negative impact.
Yeah.
Does it have the same impact?
Yeah. Well, it surely has the same value, or our judgments of value would be based on that. Would it have had the same level of citations? We all know the bias against publication of negative results. Having said that, I was trying to think, well, if his is the top cited ICT4D paper, what might be what might be the second one? I think the second most highly cited paper is the one that I wrote about information systems and failure. So, which is definitely a very negative message about ICTs and development. So I'm not saying that's got equivalent value, because it was not in any means as rigorous a paper as Rob Jensen's, but at least in terms of the impact, if you like, that was about equivalent. But that's presumably because there was a particular group of people who somehow found that message useful. Okay, thanks for that. Anybody got any more general thoughts about what we've covered today? Okay, what I'd like you to do, if you wouldn't mind, is to break for one last exercise, which is just to have a chat with your neighbours again, thinking about your own experiences of writing up research, and try to identify one lesson that you'd like to share, one good practice lesson you'd like to share about good practice of your experience of writing up research. Thanks then for having a little discussion about those lessons from your own experience. Would anyone like to share what they've come up with in terms of what they thought was a key lesson from their own experience of writing up research? Could be a good practice or...
Well, one is the planting of the ass, to actually sit down and do it, not color code your bookcase. Do not procrastinate.
So, well, yeah, one technique that I'm really liking at the moment, I've used for a number of years, is Pomodoro. I don't know if any of you have come across it, but Pomodoro is terribly, terribly simple, which is just the notion that you spend 25 minutes working on something, 5-minute break, another 25, 5, and then a slightly longer break. I don't necessarily always absolutely stick with it, but I found it's really, really helpful for getting on with difficult tasks. I'm guessing it's because of our increasing interaction with digital technologies that well, maybe it's just me, I find it increasingly hard to get on with difficult tasks because it's so much easier to get on with a quick task. I'll just look at my email, I'll just write something on a blog, I'll just tweet something, and rather than the difficult business, particularly of writing. Pomodoro, I think, is great because 25 minutes you feel, I can survive 25 minutes of trying to do something difficult. And then it really helps you to get into those difficult tasks. As well, of course, as all the usual recommendation of, for example, just having a fixed time, like write in the mornings and do the guffy stuff and email and whatever else later on. Okay, thanks very much for that. Other lessons? You can have a second one if you want. You look like you have a second one in your mind.
I haven't written anything in forever.
Okay. Was that a lesson?
Yes, if you don't want, you don't. If you want to write.
Yeah, there are more important things in life than academic research. That's certainly true. What else did other people? You must have been discussing something.
Well, we talked about the fact that by the time you get published, we were discussing here the time frame it takes to submit your article, and it comes out 2 years later. Your data is old, etc. And that's... Yeah, I mean, there's a paper I submitted in July 2016. It just got published now, February, this year.
Why is that a problem?
It takes so much of your time, and I don't know what lesson we can actually pick from that, but we were just talking that it's not just an ICT4D subject issue, but it cuts across so many other disciplines. But
with ICT4D, it is such a fast-paced research area that that window you talked about is extremely important. And if you miss it, then by the time your paper comes out and the argument you're raising, nobody's really going to be interested because it's already been done and said.
But doesn't that then also come back to that point about where the originality comes, and that it's not just about you're just reporting on the fact that, well, this thing happened in this school with these ICTs, but that you're also trying to build some greater foundation of knowledge, that you're trying to build a model, or speak more broadly to our general understanding of pedagogy, or whatever. So it's thinking. So that is a really interesting point, but it's thinking a little bit about the longevity of your work and how that fits into that notion of originality and significance, isn't it? That it's not just here's a dump of new data, but here's some way that I've kind of addressed a knowledge gap and moved knowledge on and created some kind of a foundation that other people can use.
So what you're saying is we shouldn't think too much about the time frame it takes for your research to come out, but on its impact thereafter.
I think that is important, and I think that's probably helpful more than anything, because if you think this isn't going to get published until a year or 2 years' time, and anyway the data I gathered was a year ago, so first thing I think is to just let go of that burden of the fact of, oh my gosh, I've got to publish instantly and I've got to get it done so rapidly. But it's also thinking about, since it's going to be coming out in a few years' time, and since I would like to think that people will be reading it in 2, 5, maybe even 10, 20 years' time, what am I going to say? Maybe that's a really useful exercise, is to say, what has my paper got to say to people in 10 years' time? That might be a really useful little thought exercise for the paper. And realizing, well, all of the immediacy of a particular technology or a particular data will have gone, so what has my paper got to say to a longer term audience? And then that might push you to think about creating a frame or speaking in terms of significance to some wider debate or some bigger issue. So actually I think that's quite really a kind of helpful thing in a way of understanding that that's going to happen to your work. Yes.
Find out what you're good at and find complementary critical friends. That's key. Carol and I have been working a lot together and reading each other's text, and we have very different ways of approaching writing itself, thinking, writing, structuring, etc., and very different kind of skill sets, which means that when she reads my text and I read hers, it entails that you really let go. And you really like, oh, this is the way I meant it. No, this is a person who's completely different who reads it, and there's a great improvement. So if you're writing something that's difficult or is maybe new, or you're venturing into a new area, make sure I'm harking back to the people that you identified conferences who might be interested to read your work at an early stage maybe, or who you can find that kind of report with, who can be your critical friends and who you trust, who can kind of help you develop as a writer.
So that's interesting, isn't it, in terms of thinking about who the best critical friends are. Because if you imagine at one extreme, if you cloned yourself, you probably wouldn't be very helpful at all to yourself because you're the same person, sort of thing. On the other hand, you don't want someone who just doesn't understand what you're doing or why you're doing it. So there's a middle ground, isn't there, of people who are interested in the topic but coming from a somewhat different direction, and then who can input to you. And the other thing we haven't really talked about is some of the sort of process points about how you try to improve. For example, I don't know if any of you involved, have you set up a writing group, for instance, where you, some of our students I know have had writing away days where you go with a particular piece of work, you do a little presentation, and you have to produce 1,500 or 2,000 words by the end of the day, and then you'll do another presentation of that work, and you just sort of absolutely push it. You go off campus and you do it, and you just do nothing else but part your arse and just make sure you get on with that particular topic, with the writing. Any other lessons people came up with? Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I see that Edgar is hovering.
I know that this seminar has been very interesting by the way you have been attentive, and I have been monitoring. No one stepped out, so I'd like to thank you for delivering a very good seminar, and thank you for attending. There is one more thing that I wanted Professor Hicks to talk about, critical realism, but this might take extra 10 to 15. But I have an idea. If you are interested in that, we can have our fika here, or we can call it a day and have our fika and close the seminar. Coffee and tea.
So I think the suggestion was we'll take a break.
Yes.
And if anybody has got real enthusiasm for critical realism for a kind of 15-20-minute presentation on critical realism,
then we could come back in.
We'll come back and do that. And if you've realised that you've left the washing on and you've got something much more important to do than critical realism.
We do this by a show of hands of those who are
No, you will vote. I would suggest is everybody has some tea and biscuits. And if there's anybody left in the room at kind of 12:15,
even if it's just one person.
If it's just one person, I guess that'll probably be me.
No, I'm staying.
I will probably stay for my own seminar. So you don't have to vote with your hands; you just vote with your feet. If there's anybody here in 15,
and we have fika for everyone, even if you didn't register, it doesn't matter. So please.
Well, 15 or 20. I mean.
Yeah. Yes. So 10 minutes, let's do our fika. Thank you.
No, I'm staying.
Okay, so where the previous part of the session was kind of nice and fairly light and interactive, this is going to be the opposite. This is going to be rather dense and not very interactive. So really we should have done them the other way around. Anyway, never mind. The presentation's based on a recently published paper written with PJ Wall from Trinity College in Dublin. And it's pretty academic and reflecting on what I sometimes try to call our academic discipline of development informatics, which means the subdiscipline that researches ICT4D research. We don't often talk about research paradigms in ICT4D research. We're not often explicit about the research paradigms that are being used. But if we look at those few that are explicit, and if we certainly analyse implicitly what the research paradigms are underneath them, we'll see that, as in much of social sciences, ICT4D research to date has been dominated by positivism, a bit, and strong positivism only a little bit, kind of weak implicit positivism quite a lot, and also by interpretivism. Both of which have quite strong critiques, which I rather glibly summarise as the fact that positivism is useful but not true, and interpretivism is true but not useful. And of course there are many other critiques of both of them as well. Because of those critiques, people have been looking around for, helping to develop, helping to revitalise alternative paradigms to positivism and interpretivism. And critical realism is one such that has arisen as a third way. And our intention in writing this paper was that by outlining the features of critical realism as a research philosophy and looking or making an argument about how the particular features of critical realism might apply to ICT4D research, we hope to allow people to make a decision for themselves about whether critical realism could be a useful research paradigm for them. We are, PJ and I, we are We are believers in critical realism, so we're somewhat cheerleading for critical realism, and so the paper doesn't really deal with the critiques of critical realism, so you have to kind of bear that in mind as a caveat for the paper and also the presentation. Presentation paper in two parts. First of all, what is critical realism? Secondly, how does it apply to ICT4D research? In terms of explaining what critical realism is, we say that you can describe a research philosophy, a paradigm, in terms of four ologies, which is ontology, epistemology, methodology, and axiology. So I will move to the first of those, which is the three-layer ontology. Apologies for those of you, by the way, who already know critical realism, because this is very much a 101 on the topic. Three-layer ontology, in other words, three-layer understanding of what is real out there in the world. Critical realism arguing that social structures are real, but they are independent of human experience, hence the wall there. But that social structures can't be known directly. So an example of a structure might be an information infrastructure. I don't mean just in terms of the technology, but in terms of the processes, people, stakeholders, values, and so on of an information infrastructure might be an example of the real. Those structures and their context have mechanisms. Mechanisms are powers and tendencies that generate and that cause both events and non-events at the level of the actual. So events might be things like the development of an ICT app or the appointment of an ICT4D champion. And the final layer is the empirical, which is the realm of experience of what can be observed. And that ontology also then tells us about the epistemology of critical realism, that is its notion of how we construct, how we evaluate knowledge about reality. We can't directly experience the structures, the mechanisms. Our own experience is also shaped by context, so our observations are not objective, and hence the summary of critical realism, that it combines a realist ontology with an interpretive epistemology. So that's why it is this kind of middle way between positivism and interpretivism. Now, critical realism, particularly the foundational writings of Roy Bhaskar, is notoriously obscure and difficult to understand. Fortunately, there are a growing number of papers proposing how we put critical realism into practice, so an increasing number of papers telling us what the methodology of critical realism is. Out of that, we picked three particular features. The first of all is retroduction. Retroduction meaning working backwards from the empirical through the actual down to the real. Basically saying, what are the structures, what are the mechanisms that we would interpret as being in place that must exist in order to produce the events and outcomes that we observe. So retroduction is the first part of the methodology of critical realism. Second part is pluralism. So within critical realism, we always triangulate data methods and sources and other things in order to validate our arguments. And the third element of methodology we identify is reflexivity. Because of the fact that context influences not just all research and also all researchers, the critical realist researcher should reflect on those influences, thinking about how their context influences the research that they do and their observations and their experiences. And finally, we have axiology. Axiology means what a research paradigm values. And this is the critical bit in critical realism, which argues that the social structures of the real domain, such as this nice little diagram here, this idea of the social structures of the real domain, can serve to generate events and processes that are oppressive and outcomes that are unequal. So critical realist research would seek to identify those structures and to emancipate people from those structures. So that is the ontology, the epistemology, the methodology, the axiology of critical realism in very brief. More details, of course, in the paper, far more details in key sources about critical realism. Anybody got any questions so far about the content bit of what critical realism means and is? In that case, I will either assume that everybody understands or nobody understands. And I will move on. I said before that we don't really make explicit use of research paradigms in ICT4D research. And the explicit use, or at least the following of any kind of research paradigm, whether it's positivism, pragmatism, interpretivism, whatever, would improve the kind of the maturity and the recognition for ICT4D research. So any research paradigm and its explicit use, we feel, would be an improvement. But we also think there are some specific values for critical realism within ICT4D research. And that's what I'm going to do in the second part, is just identify a number of problems or issues with ICT4D research or trends, and say why I think critical realism is particularly valuable in relation to those. So firstly, ICT4D practice and ICT4D research is often rather poor at recognizing the broader context, the political, the cultural, the social, the economic context, which actually we all know has a really significant influence. Critical realism helps there because it requires investigation of context, because context means those structures and mechanisms of the real that we have to take into account. Second thing that ICT4D practice and also research is rather poor at is recognizing causality, particularly the need to understand the causal connections between introducing a technology and development outcomes. And critical realism is useful in this regard because it recognizes, yes, it recognizes those causal connections are complex, yes, it recognizes those causal connections are contingent, but a central purpose of critical realism, the central task above all others of critical realism, is to look for these generative mechanisms that link structure to outcomes. And so critical realism is particularly appropriate for making use of frameworks which have common mechanisms and contextual contingency. And there are a number of those sorts of frameworks floating around, particularly in development. So the livelihoods framework is an example, the capabilities approach, this, which is an IDRC variant of the livelihoods approach, combining the central notion of common mechanisms with a broader context that provides a contingency for the outcomes. By contingency, what critical realism is essentially saying is, it's not, as with positivism, that X leads to Y. It's that X can lead to Y in certain circumstances. So the illustration that's often given is, it's not that ICTs lead to an alleviation of poverty. It's that ICTs may lead to income generation for the poor, but with a particular set of stimulating and releasing conditions, as we might call them in critical realist terms, with a particular set of complementary inputs and contextual supporting variables, as we might call it in more general terms. Another problem for ICT4D, both in terms of practice and research, is that it can suffer from the domination of the views of one particular set of stakeholders. Typically, these will be sort of top-down, so it would be the designers or the vendors or the donors or government officials who dominate, but it could also be more bottom-up. It could be one section of a community that dominates practice and that also then dominates the views that are reflected in research. Critical realism helps here because it not only legitimizes, but it requires attention to the expressed views of a whole variety of different individuals and different groups. That's the essence of the methodological pluralism. That's the essence of triangulation, something that positivism at least struggles to deal with. All research suffers from problems of poor reliability and validity. I mean, as a domain, not in terms of just not specific individual items. And to make our research more rigorous, following any research paradigm properly would help. But again, we argue that critical realism is particularly good at making our research rigorous because of this iterative retroduction, the fact that it's contingent in relation to causality, because it's reflexive for individual researchers, and because of this methodological pluralism and triangulation. All of those help to recognize and to some degree mitigate sources of unreliability and invalidity within research. So those are some problems of ICT4D research that critical realism can particularly help to address. Then there are some essences or trends in ICT4D research that, again, we think critical realism is particularly good at addressing. So first of all, by its very definition, this isn't the picture is not really relevant, I've got to be honest, but when I saw it, I just thought, got to somehow include that. The point here, ICT4D is by its very nature oriented to practice, to getting out in the field and doing something in the world. Critical realism fits very well there because of its engagement with change. It's supportive of practice-oriented disciplines. It's supportive of action research. And I think it's also specifically congruent with the transformational aspirations of the SDG. So you can sum it up using a variant of Marx's well-worn phrase that the point of critical realism is not merely to interpret the world, but also to change it. So critical realism fits very well with the idea of ICT4D wanting to change the world. And then finally, critical realism can support a couple of trends that we identify within ICT4D. So the first of these, reflected in special issues and in conference tracks as well, is what we call the political turn in ICT4D. The growing interest in the relationship between power and politics and ICTs and development. Critical realism can facilitate that interest in power politics and ICTs. It's centrally concerned with power structures, but it sees them as shaping rather than determining. So it allows a space for human agency. Particularly if you want to know about that, you can look at Margaret Archer's ideas around morphogenesis, where she shows how critical realism deals with structure, incorporates agency, and allows for an understanding of how power and politics shapes but does not determine outcomes in ICTs and development. Second trend is what we might call the ethical turn in ICT for development. We see this in the increasing use of SENS ideas in ICT4D. He, of course, centrally being concerned with a focus on justice. Growing literature, growing guidelines about ethics and ICT for development. Growing ideas about data ethics and data justice. That firstly, all of those ideas, first of all, resonate generally with the critical in critical realism, the fact that it seeks to emancipate. But it also resonates with something else, which is if we look at the roots of ethics and justice and rights, they lie in the structures of society. And of course, critical realism is specifically interested in the structures of society. So it's kind of uniquely appropriate for work on ICT4D and ethics and justice, because it combines this desire to both understand and also to progressively change the social structures that envelop ICT4D. If we believe then that critical realism has a particular value in ICT for development, we would also need to recognize that there are criticisms of critical realism. Positivists critical of it, interpretativists critical realists themselves critical of critical realism, and so on. So first of all, you'd need to get up to speed if you want to incorporate critical realism into your work. You need to at least have some understanding of those kind of critiques. Critical realism is also pretty time-consuming to get your head around. The readings, as I say, are quite dense. And it's also quite time-consuming to apply as a methodology because of these rounds of retroduction and the need for thick descriptions and this pluralism and the need for reflexivity and so on. So you have to be aware that critical realism is quite time-consuming as a research paradigm to follow. And then there are also some more practical challenges. Relatively few researchers or supervisors in ICT4D are familiar with critical realist approaches. Relatively few referees for articles that we might seek to publish are familiar with critical realism as well. And there have been relatively few methodological guides to applying critical realism in ICT4D. To address this, you'd need training, you'd need conference tracks, you'd need particular kind of workshops, and you'd also need special issues, which brings me to the very last slide, which is that PJ and I, together with Devinder Thapa, have just edited a special issue of the Electronic Journal of Information Systems in Developing Countries on critical realism and ICT4D. This paper appears in that special issue. The papers themselves are already available in early view, and they're going to be published this month as the collected special issue. So if you'd like to understand more about, not just about this kind of theoretical notion of why ICT4D and critical realism might be a particularly good fit with each other, but specifically understanding examples of how we do critical realist research in ICT4D. So quite a number of the papers take some stepped or staged methodologies and show how they've applied it in their own work, not in a heavyweight way, but in a relatively light touch way to their research. So if you're interested in that, then please do refer to those papers. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Am I?
Is your group part of the Ramesses?
No, I'm not sure I even know what that is.
The UK funded realist and meta analysis.
No. So PJ is very much involved with critical realist research and very much goes along to those kind of things. For me, I'm less centrally concerned with critical realism. I'm not going to make that a kind of life's work track in ICT for development. A bit like what I sort of said before about some of the papers I'm coming across trying to ride two horses, saying they're contributing to critical realism and contributing to ICT4D. So I take an instrumental view, which is I'm interested in it, I'm going to use it in my own work, but I'm not going to get in so deep that I want to be saying that I'm going to be making a contribution to critical realism myself, because my focus is making a contribution to ICT for development. But I can see that you could flip it round and you could say my tribe is critical realist research and methodologies, and I'm going to use ICT4D as the mechanism and the examples in order to make a contribution to that particular audience and that particular grouping. Okay, thanks very much for that. Yes? So, I mean, the slides will all be available. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Lots of people are going to want to watch that all over again. Yes?
Well, thank you for a great presentation. I was actually curious of the critical realism. Considering how wide it is and how overarching, and it takes in everything, almost. I mean, you have structures, you have thick descriptions, you have all of the analysis of all the standpoints of all of the stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Wouldn't it be almost tempting to say that this is a good approach for a research group rather than an individual researcher.
You could certainly see that you might say that it would be sort of for a PhD, for example, which has that sort of that breadth. One of my key concerns is that, particularly because of the emergence of a couple of key papers on methodologies for critical realism, that everybody suddenly thinks there is only one very heavyweight way to apply critical realism. I think that would be a real retrograde step if everybody started to think that. Critical realism, first and foremost, is a way of understanding the world. And you have a simple test, which is, does it fit with how you think the world works? I mean, that's the very first test. Research paradigms are almost like religions, aren't they? And you should choose the one that fits you and your beliefs, and then look to apply that. I think if you do that, then critical realism, if you are a critical realist as opposed to a pragmatist or a positivist or an interpretivist or whatever, then necessarily, if it fits with the way you think about the world, you will be doing research in a critical realist way. And I don't think it behooves you then to have to do this massive job of, I did this and then I did this and then I did this. Things in some ways were happier a few years ago when certainly we were all critical realist researchers, but we didn't have to kind of prove it in this very dogmatic one-size-fits-all style. We would just have to explain in a general sense, well, this is how we did our research. This is how, in a general sense, we understand the structures and the models that underlie what's going on. And this is how we took into account the triangulation and the pluralism and so forth. So I think it's perfectly legitimate to be a critical realist and to write up your critical realism a whole spectrum of depths of engagement with the ideas and the methodologies of critical realism. By all means, if you want to use those structured methodologies and approaches, absolutely do go ahead with it. But my fear is, particularly with PhDs, that students will have to end up doing the riding two horses thing of having to prove themselves as critical realists, which practically would require a PhD on its own, and prove themselves in whatever the particular topic area that they're doing. And I think you can't do that within a single piece of work. I've certainly run across it myself, trying to have to prove two things, and your 8,000 word research article moves to 10,000 and 12,000 and 14,000 words, and then it gets rejected, and because it's now 14,000 words, there's nowhere else you can publish it. Yeah. Yes, anyone else got questions or?
Yes. Could you say something about how do you see critical realism in relation to critical theory and even structuralism?
Okay, yeah. Sorry, and one thing I should just say is that was one of the points, coming back to the previous question, that was one of the points of our special issue, was to show that you can use critical realism in a relatively light touch way without having to go all down the heavyweight way. People kind of disagree about what the critical in critical realism means and where it comes from. But our interpretation is that it comes from the similar roots as those of critical theory, and the notion that that there are therefore structures of society that are oppressive and that we need to make changes through understanding them. I don't think it would be true to say that if you're a critical theorist, you have to be a critical realist. But we would interpret critical realism certainly the other way around as saying that you would be looking for the structures of society, but trying to avoid structural determinism of saying that all that happens when we say introduce ICTs is that they merely reproduce and reinforce existing structures. They clearly don't. ICTs are changing the rules of the game. We can interpret that one way in terms of structure and agency, and the fact that structure shapes agency and agency reshapes structure, but there isn't a complete kind of reinforcement of the two, and then we would look for all kinds of explanations of how you get the freedom of agency from conflicts and clashes of logics and so on within structures. Of course, there are various different ways in which we interpret the relationship between structure and agency. I think then a more difficult question is where technology fits into all that. Of course, does technology represent structure? Does technology represent agency, and so on? Well, there are lots of papers written about that topic, and you'd have to think where particularly you fit into that. In general, I would say that technologies slowly change structures, but they do so through the agency of individuals. They essentially kind of change the playing field, don't they? They change the landscape on which the relationship between structure and agency plays out. One only has to look at politics, for example, to understand the way in which, to some extent, the advent of social media has been reinforcing of existing political elites, but on the other hand, it has also been a strongly democratizing force as well, from a liberal perspective, both a good way and also a bad way. Okay, thanks for that. Edgar, were there any kind of questions from the floor? But that's fine. Great. Okay.
Thank you once again. Second big round of applause for Richard Hicks. You've been a great audience. If you want to know more about critical realism, I think one picture in the slides where the chicken is on the laptop sums everything up. That's what most of us, think towards the world. We don't look at the reality often. I don't know if someone else wants to say something, but thank you, everyone, and